What if the United States of America, this global power we know today, were to split into several distinct nations? The idea seems almost unthinkable. After all, the United States has long been the symbol of federal unity, the American dream, and institutional stability. But behind the image of a powerful and united country lies a more complex reality: cultural, political, and economic fractures that have run through the nation since its inception. So let us imagine for a moment that this great country breaks into several pieces, that each region follows its own path, and that the star-spangled banner is replaced by a mosaic of new flags. What would really happen? At first glance, such a disintegration would shake the global order. The United States is not just a country. It represents the backbone of the global economy and the planet's main military force. Divided, it would lose this colossal weight that allows it to compete with blocs like China or the European Union. But before analyzing the international consequences, it is necessary to understand what could trigger such a scenario. Internal cracks already exist. Politically, the United States is increasingly polarized. The southern and central states, more conservative, clash head-on with the east and west coasts, often progressive and globally oriented. Culturally, the differences are deep. California is nothing like Texas, and New York does not share the same priorities as North Dakota. Economically, some states like California or Texas have economies comparable to entire countries, giving them a level of autonomy that, in an extreme scenario, could fuel secessionist desires. If the country were to break apart, it is likely that several blocs would form. The West, dominated by California, could become a technological and ecological power focused on innovation and energy transition. The South, led by Texas, would rely on oil, agriculture, and a strong conservatism. The Northeast, with New York and Washington, would maintain significant financial and diplomatic weight. As for the Midwest, the agricultural heart of the country, it might form a confederation focused on food self-sufficiency. But beyond these blocs, a crucial question arises: what would become of American military power? Currently, the United States spends more on its military than any other country and possesses one of the most formidable nuclear arsenals in the world. In case of division, this arsenal would need to be shared, negotiated, or, in the worst case, contested. Imagine several new independent states, each seeking to control a portion of the military legacy. The entire world would tremble at this risk of proliferation and instability. Economically, the disintegration would be just as devastating. The dollar, the international reference currency, would lose credibility if the country supporting it fragmented. Financial markets would plunge into uncertainty, investors would turn away, and a new currency war could erupt. China would see a unique opportunity to promote the yuan as an alternative to the dollar, while Europe would attempt to strengthen the euro. Global economic balances would be upended overnight. But this scenario is not only a matter of numbers and international strategy, it also touches the identity of Americans. Since the Civil War in the 19th century, the idea of an indivisible union has been part of the collective consciousness. Yet current divisions show that part of the population doubts this unity. Some feel like strangers in their own country, as if the United States were no longer a single nation, but several cultures forced to coexist. If such a separation were to occur, the social shock would be immense. Families divided between two newly independent states, workers forced to cross borders to do their jobs, students seeing their degrees lose value on one side but not the other. Daily life would be disrupted in every detail. Yet history shows that nothing is impossible. The USSR, once seen as an indestructible superpower, collapsed into a series of independent republics. Yugoslavia tore itself apart in pain. Even in the heart of Europe, nations like Czechoslovakia chose to separate peacefully. The United States is not immune to such upheavals. So what would remain of the American dream? Perhaps nothing more than a memory of a time when 50 stars shone together on a flag. Or perhaps new nations would emerge, each seeking to embody, in its own way, the values of freedom and prosperity. One thing is certain: the whole world would watch in astonishment at this disintegration, for the fall of a giant is never an isolated event. It always sends shockwaves across the planet. Let us now imagine the day after this disintegration. The United States is no longer a single nation, but a constellation of new countries, each drawing its own borders, establishing its own government, currency, and ambitions. The star-spangled banner folded away. The entire world holds its breath. Traditional allies, from NATO to the European Union, wonder, should they deal with a multitude of new American republics, or wait for a leader to emerge from this chaos to restore a single voice to the North American continent? This uncertainty would immediately plunge global diplomacy into an unprecedented state of confusion. The first visible consequence would be the fragmentation of the military. Today, American military power rests on exceptional centralization, a single chain of command, one president as commander-in-chief, one colossal budget. But in a scenario of division, each new state would want control over a share of this power. Who would inherit the aircraft carriers, strategic bases, or satellite technology? Even more worrying, who would hold the nuclear weapons? If California claimed a share, if Texas demanded its own, if the Northeast refused to cede its influence, the world would enter an era of instability comparable to the Cold War but multiplied, because it would no longer be two superpowers facing off, but several fragments of a single one. Internal rivalry would quickly turn into economic competition. Take California, which could become an autonomous technological power. It hosts Silicon Valley, the global engine of digital innovation and artificial intelligence. As an independent country, it would attract massive investments and could establish its own digital currency, directly competing with the dollar. Meanwhile, Texas, with its oil and agriculture, would position itself as an energy giant. An independent Texas alone could influence the global oil market, much like Saudi Arabia does today. The Northeast, led by New York and Washington, would retain a central role in global finance. Wall Street, even without the other states, would remain an essential hub for stock exchanges and international banking. Yet its strength would be weakened by the loss of national unity and by the emergence of competing currencies in the other American blocs. The Midwest, meanwhile, would become an agricultural republic, self-sufficient and perhaps inward-looking, but indispensable for feeding its neighbors. Socially, the impact would be devastating. Americans currently move freely from state to state. Tomorrow, these movements could be restricted by new borders, passports, and visas. Imagine a student from Illinois wanting to study in California, or a worker from Texas seeking employment in the Northeast. They would now have to cross an international border. Families divided across multiple blocks would see their daily lives shattered. The idea of a common American identity would disappear, replaced by increasingly marked regional affiliations. But that is not all. Healthcare, education, social security, all these services would now depend on the wealth and priorities of each new state. California might implement health coverage similar to European models, while Texas, adhering to its conservative traditions, would rely on a more privatized system. The Northeast, rich in infrastructure, would likely offer high-level education, while the Midwest, less industrialized, might struggle to fund its universities. Thus, depending on where one was born, an American would no longer have the same rights, opportunities, or future. Internationally, the consequences would be enormous. US allies accustomed to dealing with a stable and powerful giant would have to rethink all their strategies. NATO, built around American military strength, would lose its backbone. Europe would be forced to strengthen its own military to compensate. Russia and China, historic rivals, would immediately seize this opportunity. Beijing could expand its influence in the Pacific, enticing an independent California with trade agreements. Moscow would seek to negotiate with an autonomous Texas to further weaken Western cohesion. Culturally, the shock would be immense. America has long projected its influence through cinema, music, TV series, and sports. Hollywood, now isolated in California, would continue to shine, but without the support of a national identity, this influence could fragment. Professional sports, a symbol of American unity, would break into multiple national leagues. The Super Bowl would no longer exist as a unifying event, replaced by regional competitions. At the heart of it all, the identity question would remain the most painful. What does it mean to be American in a world where the United States no longer exists? Some would continue to claim this identity as a nostalgic inheritance. Others would embrace their new affiliation, whether Californian, Texan, or Northeastern. This transformation would be brutal, challenging over 2 centuries of shared history. And as Americans attempted to rebuild their lives in this new order, the rest of the world would watch with a mix of fascination and fear. Such upheaval would not concern America alone. It would redefine global balances. Emerging powers would find an open field to assert themselves. Traditional alliances would collapse or reinvent themselves. The 21st century would take an entirely different turn, where fragmentation replaced unity and uncertainty became the new norm. What if this disintegration went even further? Imagine that, a few years after the division, the fragments of the United States permanently ceased trying to reunite and become fully recognized nations by the United Nations, each with its own flag, constitution, and ambitions. This would not be just an internal reorganization, but a global redefinition. Since the end of World War II, America has acted as a policeman, arbitrator, economic engine, and cultural model. What would happen if this pillar disappeared? The first shock would be geopolitical. The UN Security Council would lose its most powerful member, replaced by several weakened and divided voices. The capacity for international intervention would diminish. Take, for example, a conflict in Africa or the Middle East. Previously, Washington would decide to send troops, mobilizing allies and bases around the world. Now, California, Texas, the Northeast, or the Midwest would each have their own position, often contradictory, unable to present a common strategy. This would open the door to new powers. China would become the inevitable arbiter. Russia would strengthen its influence. India would emerge as an alternative. And Europe, despite its own divisions, would have no choice but to become more autonomous. The global economy would plunge into an era of turbulence. The US dollar, currently the world's reserve currency, would instantly lose its status. Each new country formed from the United States would need to create its own currency, leading to spectacular spectacular fluctuations. Financial markets, once centered on New York, would disperse to London, Frankfurt, Shanghai, Singapore, or Dubai. The stability that allowed global trade to function would be replaced by permanent volatility. Investors, worried, would seek safe havens, perhaps in gold, perhaps in cryptocurrencies, but certainly no longer in a unified American currency. Trade would also suffer a violent shock. Imagine the border between an independent Texas and an agricultural Midwest. Tariffs, border checks, and regulatory divergences would make domestic trade almost as complex as international trade. Companies that could previously sell nationwide would find themselves fragmented. Global supply chains that depended on the fluidity of the American market would need to be completely reorganized. A car built in Michigan, for example, would have to cross multiple borders before reaching California, increasing costs and slowing the industry. Beyond the economy and geopolitics, citizens' daily lives would be upended. Americans would wake up in a world where their passports were no longer universally recognized as symbols of power and mobility. Some travelers would proudly carry a Californian passport, others a Texan passport, but none would benefit from the global authority of the former American passport. The pride of belonging to a nation considered a superpower would be replaced by permanent uncertainty. American culture, once homogeneous and exported worldwide, would fragment. Hollywood would continue to exist but would no longer have the support of an entire country to distribute its films. Music, once propelled by a massive national market, would diversify but lose its central role. Sports, the ultimate symbol of American unity, would reflect the fragmentation. Basketball might be dominated by California, football by Texas, baseball by the Northeast, but no event would unite the former 50 stars under a single flag. This loss of unity would not only be a tragedy for Americans, but for the entire world. America, despite its contradictions, represented an ideal for millions: immigration, innovation, and the possibility of success through work and ambition. If that ideal shattered, much of the global dream would vanish with it. Refugees seeking a welcoming land, students dreaming of Harvard, entrepreneurs aiming for Silicon Valley would have to look elsewhere. Yet within this chaos, there would also be opportunities. Some of the new countries emerging from America could invent innovative models. California, rich and technological, could become a pioneer of ecology, developing a sustainable society and influencing the entire world. Texas, strong in its traditions and energy, could become a key regional power. The Northeast, with its universities and finance, could establish itself as a new global intellectual center. Each fragment would have the chance to build something new, different, bold. But the big question would remain: would this fragmentation strengthen democracy, bringing power closer to citizens, or would it plunge these new countries into authoritarianism, each trying to assert dominance over the others? History shows that divisions often lead to conflict. Regional civil wars would not be impossible, as tensions between these blocs would be inevitable. The sharing of resources, access to trade routes, management of water, oil, and agriculture could all become pretexts for confrontation. The world in this scenario would enter a new era, an era where the void left by a united United States would be filled by multiple actors, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies. An era where power is no longer concentrated but dispersed. An era where familiar landmarks vanish, giving way to unpredictability. So one question remains: what if, instead of splitting, the United States found a way to reinvent itself, to confront its divisions without allowing them to break its union? Deep down, this speculation, as fascinating as it is, serves as a warning. America, like any great power, is not eternal. Its survival depends on its ability to remain united despite its differences. And if it fails, it will not only be its destiny that shifts, but that of the entire world. So, what would you do if a country as powerful as the United States suddenly fragmented? Do you think new nations would emerge stronger, or would the world plunge into chaos? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Your ideas might surprise everyone. And if you love exploring these fascinating what-if scenarios, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss our next geopolitical speculations.